Britain may have deeper problems due to the historic nature of the country's political system, the location of the government at the Palace of Westminster in London, and the traditional class structures that may determine who's who in the hierarchy. The new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, bears the honorific title Sir Keir, but his knighthood belies his working class roots and education. Still, his so-called Oxbridge education continues a long tradition common to almost every British Prime Minister who attend either of Britain's elite universities, Oxford or Cambridge. These issues are the subject of a book by British-French journalist Alun Drake, who sees a system that is desperately in need of repair if there's to be any real democracy in the United Kingdom. In Fixing Broken Britain, a blueprint for national revival, Drake explores the potential disasters of the current situation, from a lack of real representation for the working classes to the risk of the Houses of Parliament's antiquated sewage system actually exploding. I travelled to London to sit down with Alun Drake and seek some insight into what he believes is wrong with Britain and how it might be fixed. Alun, thanks for making the time.
Pleasure to be here.
We'll go into details on what you've written in the book, but let's start with the title. Quite provocative. Fixing Broken Britain. Is it that bad?
Well, if you look at the news every day, I don't think you can draw any other conclusion, really. And it's a phrase that becomes more and more used in the media. If you look at the number of people using food banks, the amount of pollution in the rivers, the situation in the National Health Service, where people have to wait an extraordinary length of time to get medical attention, I don't think there's any other way to look at it as broken Britain.
I'm curious as to what made you want to write this book. I mean, full disclosure, you and I were journalists, 40 years ago in the BBC, and I've seen you go through that journalist path and then end up in the Council of Europe. But what made you think about focusing on Britain?
Well, when you live abroad from a country that you grew up in, I think you have a better perspective of it because you have something to compare it with. In my case, I could compare it with France, and I live 2 kilometers from the border with Germany, so I'm often in Germany. So in effect, I have 2 countries to compare the UK with. And when it comes to particularly transport and health, there's no comparison between the 2 countries. For example, Strasbourg has 5 or 6 tram lines, whereas the city where I grew up, Cardiff, is not even one. And I guess it was a sense of frustration that grew over the years that Britain was not progressing as it should for quite a wealthy economy in the world. And I guess Brexit was the last straw because this affected my life directly by making me a non-EU citizen and having to apply for French nationality, for example, which is quite a big deal. So I guess it was a sense of frustration and also a desire to explain to people, in particular, even in my own family, my children who never grew up in the UK, how this country functions and what its weak points are and how to put it right.
So I should say, ironically, we've got the Palace of Westminster behind us as a backdrop. And on page 2 of your book, you write, "Inspiring architecture does not necessarily make for inspired political decision-making. As a venue for a modern parliament, the Palace of Westminster would never win any prizes." It's a huge tourist attraction and it looks beautiful, so what's wrong with it?
Well, I think as a functioning place of work for politicians, it's not very functional. That is to say, it has many safety aspects, fire risks, asbestos risks, even sewage risks. There's a risk apparently of the ancient sewage ejection system exploding, which would be quite nasty. Also the way that it's not functional for disabled people, so the handicapped and cannot access it correctly. But most of all, I think, is the design of this place, which is originally a palace, of course, so it's not a democratic venue in a sense by definition. But also this the design of the House of Commons, which is like 2 opposing benches of people looking at each other, often shouting at each other, instead of the normal European design, which is a circle where people are more inclined to compromise, to be more moderate and collaborate and cooperate with each other.
And those 2 seats are 2 swords apart?
That's exactly right. This goes back to ancient traditions where it grew up in a form of a church, which is why it's like the form that it takes. And as you say, there are two swords, distances between the two sides to keep them from physically attacking each other. But there are other traditions like snuff boxes, which are provided for people to take, and so on and so forth. It's really rooted in tradition, but there's no, for example, another problem with it, there's fewer seats than there are MPs. So for example, there are 400 and something seats, but 650 MPs. So there are not enough seats for people to sit in. And that means that you can't have electronic voting, which is another thing that most parliaments have.
And essentially by being a two-seat system facing each other, there's no room for multi-party politics.
Well, the whole design of the House of Commons at Westminster is confrontation and winner takes all. So it's not about collaboration and cooperation. It's about one party lording it over the other parties.
Britain's also unique in having a House of Commons and a House of Lords. And you write a whole chapter on the House of Lords where you say, the House of Lords is a massive insult to democracy and a monstrous carbuncle on the face of British public life.
That quote was an amalgam of two other quotes, which one was from the Prince of Wales, now the King, King Charles, and the other one was a reference to the death of Dylan Thomas, who inflicted a massive insult to his brain by drinking too many whiskies at a bar in New York. So why do I say that? Because there are so many things that are anti-democratic about the House of Lords. First of all, it's unelected, and many of the people just get appointed because they're party donors or perhaps friends or associates of the Prime Minister of the day. Then you have the fact that people at the House of Lords, there are 800 or so of them, and they don't have to do any work, but they can claim £300 a day for just turning up. And it's quite paradoxical that in the UK there's a lot of emphasis on benefit fraud, that's to say poor people falsely claiming unemployment benefit or other benefits, but you can go to the House of Lords, you can claim for £300 to do absolutely nothing and nobody bats an eyelid. That's normal behaviour. Well, I don't think it is normal behaviour, and that's why I say that we should replace the House of Lords with something more democratic.
Why has this system, which you describe as so redundant and perhaps corrupt in a kind of financial way, why has no one challenged it before?
I think the British are peculiarly attached, and especially the ruling class in Britain, to tradition and privilege and class. And I think that because things have been this way for so long, there's a reluctance to challenge them because of a fear, if you like, about what might happen if we change one part of the system. It's like that game with a pile of bricks, and if you remove one brick, you might bring the whole thing crashing down. I also think it has something to do with the fact that the UK has never been invaded for so long, and therefore it's never had to change through domination of a foreign power. And there's never really been a revolution in the UK in the French sense of the revolution. So the ruling class has been able, and the ruling traditions have been able to carry on without being challenged.
One of the things that Britain has is, as we said, perhaps a slightly antiquated system with the House of Commons, the House of Lords. We've got this kind of monarchy as well in the mix. Other countries have developed their own systems, and you did a chapter on constitution. And in that, you talk about modern democracies. You say, in a modern democracy, every citizen should have a basic understanding of the Constitution. The one thing that everyone can agree on is that the UK's current constitutional arrangements are opaque at the best of times, and we're not living in the best of times, you say. So what's wrong with the lack of understanding? Where is it that we're missing some understanding of it?
Well, as you say, most countries in the world have a written constitution or a codified constitution, one that brings everything together in one place. The problem with the British system is that it's an uncodified system, constitution. There are lots of pieces of paper around, but there are also lots of conventions. And these are things which depend on people's goodwill and good behaviour. And we've seen over the last 10 years that conventions are not always observed, and that's one of the problems with the UK, is that there are no hard and fast rules. You can make things up as you go along. For example, with the Brexit vote, this was a very important constitutional change for the UK, and in a normal democracy, if you change the constitution, you need a 2/3 majority, which would be 66%. In the Brexit vote, it was sufficient just to have a simple one-vote majority over the other side, which is like 52% to 48%. It's hardly majority at all, and so it divided the country in a kind of very brutal way. And there were no other rules concerning the referendum either. For example, in Switzerland, if you want to have a successful referendum, you have to have a majority of the cantons to vote for the proposition. So in a UK context, that would have mean that, say, England, Scotland and Wales would have had to have voted for, and it wouldn't have mattered if Northern Ireland voted against, because it would have been a 3-1 victory. But it was a 2-2 score draw in the case of the referendum on Brexit, which in another kind of democracy would have meant that the proposition to leave the European Union would have failed. So in other words, not having a clear constitution can lead to some quite major disruptions in the country because you simply haven't written things down in a clear way, like an instruction manual.
So let's look at Brexit specifically. You said obviously it affected your life in quite a negative way. What other things have happened that tell you that there was a big mistake?
Well, I think if you look at the simple economic statistics, that there's no evidence of any benefits economically to Brexit. Of course, it was sold as an opportunity to do a lot of trade with the rest of the world, but these opportunities don't seem to have been taken up, and at the same time it's become much more difficult to trade with Europe due to red tape and higher cost of doing business, basically. So I think the main thing fallout from Brexit has been a hit to the economy, which of course has also hit public services because there's less tax revenues and so on to pay for things like the National Health Service, transport and all the rest of it.
So talking to the French and German people you get to meet regularly, how has their opinion of Britain changed because of Brexit?
I think most French and German people still feel a great deal of affection for the UK because it has great cultural capital, things like the pop music and comedy on television and so on and so on. But I do think people are mystified by what they see as an irrational decision, one that's clearly contrary to the national interest, and some people have described as an act of national self-harm. So I think that they feel sorry for us. They don't say that to me outright, but I would say that on the whole, people are kind of bemused.
And it doesn't really help that when you watch British government at work, it seems kind of a bit of a spectacle too. You write about parliamentary behaviour, which seems to become, well, because of televising, has become much more visible to people. It says in your book, if global Britain wants to truly earn the world's respect, it needs to get its house, the House of Commons, in order. It's high time to banish buffoonery, shun celebrity, and prorogue politainment.
Yeah, politainment was a word I made up for I don't think it's only me that made it up, but it's this mixture of entertainment and politics that seems to drive British news coverage of politics, that it seems that we have a very short attention span, that we want our politics to be like a pantomime in some ways, with people shouting at each other, very much based on people's personalities and character, what they look like, how they eat a sandwich in the case of a former Labour leader, and all kinds of irrelevant details. I mean, I think if you look at Germany and France, they do things in a much more serious way without this need for politicians to go on game shows, to go and become entertainers, either by showing their dancing prowess or their prowess in the jungle or whatever it is on British TV. French politicians and German politicians don't really feel the need to prove themselves in that way.
Do you think that kind of behaviour, though, adversely affect sound decision-making when it comes to politics?
I think there's a distinction between the show business side of it, which is the House of Commons, especially Prime Minister's Question Time, and the decision making, which is of course informed by experts in the civil service and other sources of expertise. So I don't think it impacts too much on the quality of decision making. I think that's more about our electoral system and the way that it's not representative, which is something we can maybe talk about in a moment.
On proportional representation, you say, proportional representation fits perfectly with traditional British values like fairness and non-discrimination. A country that believes in equality when it comes to ethnicity, religion, gender and sexual orientation should also believe in equality when it comes to casting a vote. What's really amiss there?
Well, I think the problem is that the British political system in its voting pattern, in its voting system, does not reflect the strength of opinion in the country. So, for example, in the book, I refer to the 2015 general election when UKIP, that's the UK Independence Party that wanted Brexit, they got 3.8 million votes, which is 15% of the electorate. And for that, they got one seat in Parliament for 3.8 million votes. Similar distortions happened with the Green Party and to a certain extent with the Liberal Party. That is to say, you have some parties that are overrepresented, which tend to be the main parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. And then you have people who don't get any representation in Parliament at all. And this is not how democracy should work. Democracy, if you have a parliament, it should represent all shades of opinion, even ones that we don't agree with ourselves. For example, I'm passionately anti-Brexit, but I do believe that the Brexit party, the UKIP party, was incredibly hard done by. And if you had had those voices in Parliament, maybe you wouldn't have had the need for a referendum. You could simply have had a vote. So for me, it's about justice, really. And as I say, as you quoted, if we've gone to such an extent in this country to stop discrimination against people of different colour, sexual orientation and different religions, why should we still be discriminating against, for example, Green Party voters, Liberal Democrat voters, voters for the Brexit Party? Why should not they have the right to have their representation in Parliament along with everyone else?
So what it boils down to is a serious imbalance in the way different voices are being heard in the country.
That's right. And one of the things that would happen under a proportional system would be it would almost certainly force cooperation between different parties to form coalitions. And at the moment, British political discourse tends to be very raucous, and there seems to be no willingness to admit that the other side has a point or that the other side could possibly be right about anything. But in coalition, you have to strike compromises. And I think this is mature democracy. And I think this is what the UK needs to become. More boring, perhaps, but more effective as a democracy, because you'll take better decisions in the interest of the vast majority of the people if you have coalitions that represent the majority of the people.
There's often an expression used by critics of maybe perhaps traditional profiles of politicians and people in charge, and it's the pale male stale. Which seems, some would say, is the case, the way you're describing it, through the class structure in the UK. But we see members of parliament from different backgrounds, different ethnicities. So Britain seems, at a glance, to have a fairly fair representation of its diverse, ethnically diverse population. But it sounds like it's not the case, according to your book.
Well, I think we've made a lot of progress on ethnic diversity and sexual diversity. But when it comes to social mobility, that's a different kettle of fish, as we say. I think if you look at the social background of our leaders in politics, they tend to have been privately educated at expensive schools. They tend to have gone to Oxbridge or a number of elite universities in London. And they tend to have very similar social backgrounds. You don't have to have a monopoly of leadership from one particular social class, that you can actually take talented people from the working class and give them power and trust them with that power.
I should point out, you're a double first from Oxford yourself.
Well, yeah, my social journey has been from a modest background in Cardiff, the capital of Wales, to Oxford, where I studied politics, philosophy and economics, which is a bit of a cliche because that's what all of the prime ministers tend to study. And then I went to the BBC, where we met. And the BBC is another bastion of the British establishment, very middle class and dominated by a lot of people from private schools. So yeah, my journey has really showed me both sides of the tracks, if you like. I know what it's like to come from a modest or poor family, and I also know what it's like to be part of the establishment. And so that's why, in a way, I felt obliged to write this book. Another reason was to kind of give a perspective that perhaps people who come from more privileged backgrounds are not able to give.
One thing I've noticed as I dip in and out of the UK with travelling is local authorities seem not to do the job they used to do when I was young. You know, the streets were kept, well, everything. It seems they struggled to keep up financially. And you write about it. When you write about local government, you say, to quote you, a decade of austerity from 2010 to 2020 saw local authorities lose 77% of their income. How can they keep going?
It's a good question. Many, many more of them are declaring bankruptcy with each week that passes. And
so these are local government organizations basically saying, we're broke.
That's right. And as I say in the book, austerity, cutting back of central government funding for local authorities has had a lot to do with it. And this is not the situation in France or Germany or other places where there's far more autonomy for local authorities to raise taxes locally and not to depend on central government, because Britain is one of the most centralized countries in Europe, incredibly. I think only Bulgaria is more centralized. It's a sad situation, but one which is retrievable if you gave more tax-raising powers to local authorities.
So where is the money going? I mean, you know, Britain's population has continued to grow, and logically one would extrapolate that this means more return in taxes, more funds, more demand on the system, but it's 77% is a massive number in terms of financial decline.
Well, I think there was a lot of austerity in that decade that applied not only to local government, to the National Health Service and other things. So Britain really, as a country, didn't save a lot of money in the past for this kind of situation. When we had North Sea oil, we didn't set up a sovereign wealth fund like Norway did. They're a very wealthy country today because they kept that money from oil extraction. When we sold off thousands of council houses and we privatized many utilities, it seems we didn't put that into a sort of savings account either. So I think one of the reasons why Britain is feeling the chill at the moment is because in the past we didn't really prepare for a rainy day. Or I think, like a politician once said, we didn't fix the roof when the sun was shining.
You know, it's interesting because when we look at it, Britain, I mean, certainly growing up, felt like it had a huge sense of self-importance. You know, the British Empire, still talked about. You know, the sun never set on the British Empire was the phrase. So it seems to have been a massive drop over what, a couple of 100 years? It must be. So let's look at what you say about the need for education on the British Empire. A YouGov poll carried out in 2014 found that 59% of those questioned thought that the British Empire was something to be proud of. Only 19% claimed to be ashamed of its misdeeds, and more than 30% claimed they would like it if Britain still had an empire. So there's a large group of Brits who seem to think that, you know, this was a magnificent time, but there were the flaws, weren't there?
I think there were many flaws, and I don't think British people realise the kind of things that we got up to. And that's one of the reasons why they have this rose-tinted view of the British Empire. Of course, when they see ceremonies with people wearing lovely costumes and things like this, it makes you nostalgic for a past. But I don't think if you knew the real details of the past, the way that we exploited some of the countries, for example, India, the amount of resources that were taken out of India, including consequences for the population in terms of starvation, that food resources were removed. In Bengal, there was a huge famine, and I think 3 million Indians died because of that. I don't think British people realise either that at one point we were selling opium to China. So at the moment in Britain, it's still illegal to consume cannabis, but there we were, a kind of narco state, supplying at the point of a gun, forcing the Chinese to buy our opium, which was grown in India largely. There were other things like the torture that was gone on to suppress the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, the taking over of Diego Garcia, which was an island near Mauritius, which the Chagossians were expelled from to make way for a US base, and they've never been allowed back there. So many of these kind of inglorious episodes of the British Empire are kind of airbrushed out in favour of a positive narrative about what we did in World War II, where we helped to liberate Europe from the Nazis. And I think this, in some cases, is sort of a get out of jail free card to kind of expiate the sins of empire.
So if Britain had, to this degree, kind of pillaged the resources of the world to that degree, where has all that money gone?
Well, I think if you travel around Britain and you see the amount of stately homes that there are, and other ways in which it was probably ended up in private pockets, which is why it's not that much evidenced, as you say, in public things. But a lot of people became very rich, of course, and built very nice estates for themselves in the country, and townhouses in big cities. So I think the answer is that it probably ended up in people's pockets individually.
Another factor, as someone who went through the state education system, as did you, was your writing about the private education sector in Britain. And you talk about it, you say the independent sector, as you refer to it, accounts for a staggering 74% of senior judges, 71% of officers in the armed services, 55% of top civil servants in Whitehall, and 50% of cabinet ministers and members of the House of Lords. So between half and almost 3/4 of elite jobs and elite people are essentially those who went through private education, correct?
Correct, yeah.
So what does that do for true representation of the working class that don't have that benefit?
Well, I think it means it makes it much more difficult for working class children to attain those kind of positions in society. And I think the negative side of that is not only a question of equity, of fairness, of meritocracy, but it's also a question of what kind of decisions can you make for a whole country if you have an elite which is drawn from a small part of that country. So if they don't understand how working class people think and live, and what they do and what their priorities are, how are these elite people who have been separated from working class people all of their lives, how are they going to take decisions which are in the national interest? Because most people in the country are, of course, working class.
And even within the elite, there's the elite. So, for example, Eton and Harrow as private schools, public schools as they call them here in Britain, Oxford and Cambridge is a quite very narrow band. And you write, actually, Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, was the 20th old Etonian, he went to Eton, to enter Downing Street, closely following in the footsteps of his distant cousin David Cameron. For more than 200 years, there have been only 4 elected Prime Ministers in Britain, British Prime Ministers, who are not privately educated. So that's an even bigger removal from the average person, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's, again, not a very good recipe for sensible decision making if you have your Prime Minister class drawn from such a narrow band of British society. This cannot be healthy. We need, as a country, to draw people from a much wider sector of society if we're going to take decisions which are to the benefit of the vast majority of people. So I don't think you'll notice any difference in the quality of leadership between those 4 Prime Ministers who went to non-private schools and the ones who went to Eton. I think that we've done experiments to show that the private education is not the be-all and end-all when it comes to leadership. So my feeling is that we need to expand our social reach, really, and have leaders who understand more about the general population if we want to take good decisions for the future.
So what is the fix, Alan? Because so far we've got terrible Parliament building, a terrible part. Maybe Guy Fawkes missed his chance. Got a whole bunch of issues with elites running the country, removed from understanding the average person. We've got so many broken systems in the sense of even the way the Constitution or the equivalent of a constitution, written constitution, should be. It's a lot to fix. So when you say in your book, you call it a blueprint for national revival, can these things be fixed?
Well, they can be fixed. And one of the questions I address in the last chapter of the book is whether we want to fix them, whether Britain actually really is prepared to go through that process. But I recommend a lot of different things, and of course you can't do everything at once. Just like when you're renovating a house, you can't really, if you want to continue living there, you can't do everything at once. You have to do one step at a time. So I would say there are two steps which are the ones to take for the first two steps. And one is a symbolic one, which is to move to a different parliament building, because if you move to a modern purpose-built parliament building, this would symbolize a country that wants to change. So symbolically and functionally, because it would make for a much more efficient parliament and a much more efficient decision making, that is a symbolic step to take.
Sorry, would you also take it out of London, which has been the hub of everything?
I would prefer it to go to Birmingham or to Manchester, and to have it completely removed and nearer to the bigger population centres outside of London, and turn the old place into a museum of democracy to make money, like Madame Tussauds or another London tourist attraction. And the second thing is proportional representation, very cheap to do, that would transform the political landscape into a representative, democratic one.
That's fine. We change the building, we do certain things like that, but we still have the elite running the show, according to you.
Well, I think if you had a different political composition of the House of Commons, that would encourage people to go into politics who are not from the elite, because they'd realise that they would have a good chance of getting elected. And in the medium to long term, that would change the elite. The elite would no longer have that monopoly on power. And hopefully that would lead to a more diverse, in the social sense of the word, leadership.
Is it a catch-22 though, that those people in power, because of their privilege, don't want to give that up, and therefore we'll never see change?
Well, it's a good question. Obviously, it's not in the interest of anyone who has made it to the top to destroy the system that has put them there. On the other hand, there are moves afoot. For example, in the Labour Party, there is a majority now of party members who want to have proportional representation, even though that might be to the detriment of the Labour Party forming a majority government in the longer run. So effectively, you're right that it would take some act of generosity by one of the two ruling parties to actually sacrifice their party interest for the national interest and bring in a representative voting system.
So let's quote with your conclusion: we have to choose between transforming ourselves into a modern democracy or retain our debilitating system of tradition, class and privilege. Are we going to sink, giggling, into the sea, or rise from our sick bed? What do you think?
I'm not a betting man, but I know that Britain is a very conservative country with a small c. And if you had to push me on this one, I would say that I'm not holding my breath for major change in the UK. I think it will come one day, but perhaps not in my lifetime, perhaps in my children's lifetime, because I think it's like Churchill said about democracy, it's the worst form of politics apart from all the others. And I think that there's another phrase about a blind squirrel eventually finding a nut. And I would say that this is the scenario that Britain is in. I think it will falter around until it does find the right way, but it probably will, because it'll be forced to find the right way if it's to avoid decline.
Ironic, because there are so many nuts in Parliament, you'd think the squirrel will be well fed.
You said that, and I couldn't possibly.
Well, one thing, that slightly pessimistic view does mean that there's more likely to be a sequel to your sequel to your book, because Fixed Britain doesn't seem to have the same appeal. Alun Drake, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.